I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest VLGA Connect and LGIU Global Executive Panel. The topic tonight is harmonious council decision-making and setting councils up for success. Before I introduce our panellists and we get some words of welcome, I would like to, on behalf of the VLGA, acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders, past, present and future, and to their cultures. I'll give you a few housekeeping notes very shortly, but I would like to bring in Catherine Arndt, who is the CEO of the VLGA, for a few words of welcome. Good evening, Catherine.
Good evening, Chris, and thank you for that introduction, and welcome everyone to what is the third of our LGIU VLGA Global Executive Panel series. It's delightful to see you all here, although I must say from a webinar view, we actually can't see you, but you can hopefully see and hear us clearly. Thank you for joining us today, and I wanted to tell those of you who may not know a little bit more about the Victorian Local Governance Association. We are an organisation that provides a number of programs and services. We predominantly focus on leadership and governance, and in particular thought leadership, which is one of the, the themes of this Global Executive Panel series. We also deliver counsellor education and training, capacity building at both a counsellor and officer level, and partner through partnerships such as the one we have with LGIU for Impact. Our mission is to inspire and enable good governance in councils. And once again, I'm very pleased that we're able to deliver this series in partnership with LGIU. And it is my great pleasure to hand over and introduce Jonathan Carr-West. Before I do that, please save the date. We have a couple of events coming up that you may be interested in. We have our final Global Executive Panel discussion for the year on the 9th of November, and also the much anticipated Fast Track Councillor Leadership Development Program, which is being held on Friday, the 17th of November. So make a note of those. Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks everyone for coming out this morning or this evening, depending on where you are. Look, like VLGA, at LGIU, we think that some of the most innovative and effective answers to the really big challenges that we all face are coming from local government, coming from councils all around the world, doing an amazing job. But we also know that when you're in the thick of it, working in local government, it can be pretty hard to sort of find the time to get out, put your head up, see what other colleagues are doing, connect, learn and share. You know, that's often pressured out by the billions of emails we get every day and the firefighting that we're all doing all the time. So that's what today's all about. We're really happy that, again, we're able to bring you practical insights and ideas from senior execs and local authority experts all over the world. And I think this is the third year that we've been running these global local executive panels with VLGA. And we find it's a really good way of helping our communities around the world to connect. So good morning to all of you who are LGIU members joining from the UK. Good afternoon to LGIU members and other colleagues joining us from Australia. For those who don't know LGIU, we're an independent membership body and think tank for local government. We have more than 300 councils across the UK, Ireland and Australia, supported by our member benefits, research, briefings, training, etc. We know that local government is key to fixing the problems. We know that local democracy is key to local government, and our purpose is to support you to engage, connect, inform yourselves, learn, and that's what today's all about. So I hope you find it useful. I've got an amazing panel, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I will pass back to Chris so that we can get on with that.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Just a few housekeeping notes. The Q&A box is now live for any questions that you might like to ask of our panel this evening. So pop them there and we'll keep an eye on those and weave them in where we can. We will have an audience Q&A segment once we hear from each of our panelists. The chat function is still there as well. If you need to notify us about any particular issues, or if you're having some technical difficulties, that's also there for you to make comments and perhaps talk to other attendees if you so wish to do that. We are recording, and the session will be available via the VLGA Connect YouTube channel at a future point in time, and all registrants will receive a link to that. And I see a note there, let us know where you are in the chat box today. We know we've got people in the UK and in Australia, and I see we've got lots of councillors and senior executives as well. So a real mix this evening, which shows you, I guess, the appeal of the topic, harmonious decision-making and setting your council up for success. I'd like to briefly introduce our panellists. Firstly, from the City of Sydney, Chief Executive Officer Monica Barone is with us. We're going to Northern Ireland after Monica to meet Allison McCullough, who's the Chief Executive of Fermanagh and Omagh District Council. Then we have Noelene Duff, who will be well known to many of you, Chair Administrator at the City of Casey. And finally, we have Councillor Steve Holland, who's the Mayor of the Mornington Peninsula Shire in Victoria, Australia. Welcome to all our panellists. I'll say a few more words about each of them when we come to them. Starting with Monica Barone. Monica has been the CEO of the City of Sydney since 2006, managing approximately 2,000 staff, an annual operating and capital budget of $900 million or more, with $12.7 billion of assets. And in this capital works program coming up over the next 10 years, expecting to spend about $1.6 billion. Monica's also chair of the Resilient Sydney Steering Committee, a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and of Chief Executive Women. Monica, good evening. Welcome. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here.
And of course, you've been on one of our panels before, so I'm glad that that experience wasn't so stressful that you had second thoughts about coming back. 17 years in the role at the City of Sydney. I've got to ask you, what is the magic sauce for making good decisions that you've found has worked for you?
You know, often people ask me about what it is that we do at the city, and I give the answer that I'm about to give, and it sounds like it's straight out of a textbook. And people say, and I say it is straight out of a textbook, because actually, if you do things, you know, in a kind of proper and prescribed way, you can actually, you know, achieve a lot. But often I think people want to cut corners and don't want to go through all of the steps that you need to do to set up the kind of governance for good decision making. So, I mean, I'm going to say things that I'm sure everyone in the room is really familiar with. The real secret for us has been having a very clear plan that has been developed and developed with our community. You know, the first draft of that plan that we did after the Lord Mayor was elected and I was appointed took us 18 months. We spent 18 months speaking to our community to develop the plan that enabled the community in a conversation with the city to outline what it is that they wanted us to do. I often talk about, there was, thousands of conversations, surveys, workshops, and all the rest, and tens of thousands of people participated. But essentially, it all comes down to one question, and that question to the community is, what do you value? And when we understand what it is that the community value, then what we have to do then is ensure that what people value is protected or enhanced as the city grows and changes, right? And as long as we can keep going back to those values and saying, well, you told us that you value the sunlight, and that's why the sun access planes exist. It means you cannot build buildings that impact on that sunlight. Or you told us that you value fairness, and that's why we're sharing our resources with people in need. So, being able to go back to those kind of values and attributes, we're able to, really, that's the foundation piece. I'll wrap, I won't go on too much more, but of course, then all of that has got to be converted into, strategic plans, corporate plans, business plans, and the long-term financial plan. So people can actually see then how the resources are allocated. This is all available for the community, how the resources are allocated. So once you've done all of that, it's very hard to make a bad decision, because you're making a decision that is consistent with the values and plan of the organisation.
So I'm going to go to Northern Ireland now and just check that we've still got Allison online. Can you hear me, Allison?
Yes,
Excellent.
indeed, Chris, I can. Thank you.
Great. So Allison McCullough took up the post as Chief Executive of Fermanagh and Omagh District Council in 2020, and you've been with the organisation for a lot longer than that, formerly the Council's Director of Regeneration and Planning, and you were the Omagh District Council Head of Development prior to that as well. Allison, great to have you with us. It's morning time there for you in Northern Ireland. It would be great for you to set a bit of context for us, because it's very different to what we're used to here in Australia. Tell us a bit about Fermanagh and Omagh, the area.
Okay, I certainly will, Chris, and thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you. So for those of you who maybe will be familiar a little with our geography, and I'm conscious from some of the inputs, we have some UK viewers. So Northern Ireland has a population of about 1.9 million. The Fermanagh and Omagh district would be in the southwest of Northern Ireland. We're on the border with the Republic of Ireland, predominantly a rural district. We've about 116,000 residents. Our politics across really Northern Ireland and beyond is largely party-based. So we have 40 elected members. Our most recent council election was in May of this year. And for the first time, we have one party which is majority control. So Sinn Féin has 21 members. The Ulster Unionists has 7. Democratic Unionists 6. The Social Democrats 3. Alliance 2, and 1 independent member. Again, those of you who are aware of the wider political discourse will know that there is broadly a unionist and nationalist tradition within the island of Ireland. Unionists aspire to the retention of the link with the United Kingdom, and nationalists broadly with an identity with the island of Ireland, increasingly being called maybe a new Ireland as opposed to a united Ireland. And I suppose from a Fermanagh and Omagh perspective, one of the significant challenges for us is we're right on the border with the Republic of Ireland, and since the EU exit by the United Kingdom, we're also a border with the EU, which presents some specific challenges for our businesses and communities. So plenty going on. And if that wasn't enough, the role of local councils has probably become a little bit more significant, as we have not had an assembly. So the Northern Ireland Assembly would be our regional government, and it hasn't been meeting since February 2022. So there are no ministers in post. Key decisions are being taken by civil servants, and the only functioning political democratic gatherings are those taking place at councils.
So, Allison, that you told me about that when we caught up to chat ahead of this, and it sort of does my head in a little bit. So it's like us not having a state government functioning, and I can only imagine the pressure that's then falling on the councils to make decisions that perhaps it doesn't have the power to make. Have you experienced that?
Well, I think, and it actually goes back to something Monica said about what people value. I think what it has led to is a great level of confusion among the general community, because local government, which our council is one of 11, have very specific powers and functions. But because central government is essentially not functioning, or certainly not meeting in a political sense, I think there is a level of confusion about the matters that councils can intervene in, can influence, and can take decisions on. The most significant difference, I think, for us is it is having financial impacts, because one of the great benefits of having politicians is their party colleagues can engage with them directly when they're holding ministerial positions. There's an ex-resident of Omagh, which is, I don't need to explain the geography, whereas civil servants can be more detached. And in the last 4 weeks alone, we have lost £1.5 million from a function because a civil servant has taken a decision that it is not a priority in their wider financial constraints. And I don't think a minister would have taken the same decision.
So I know this is slightly off the track, but it is about decision making, isn't it? So you said this has been in place since February, that you haven't had the assembly. How long are people saying this is going to go on for?
Well, and just to be clear, since February 2022,
Yeah.
so we're in well over a year. The Northern Ireland Secretary of State has indicated that further emergency powers will need to be put in place from October of this year. So I think everyone recognises the model we have now is not sustainable. There is certainly an increased urgency and effort in political talks. Everyone is hoping the Assembly will reform and re-establish, but I think the prospects of that are probably quite limited, and there's certainly some suggestions that it may wait until after a UK general election, which doesn't have to happen until January 2025, but is expected to happen sometime next year.
Amazing. So you talked a bit about the breakdown of the party representation on your council. Can you talk a bit about what is the impact of those party affiliations on your decision-making processes? Is it a strong factor?
Interestingly, I would say the identity of place, so county identity and place identity, is as important as party identity, with the exception of some matters that in broad terms we would describe as constitutional. So, for example, if we had something coming forward that would relate directly to political matters, or whether we would work more directly with the Irish government, that is not necessarily going to be supported by unionist politicians. And similarly, if there was something that we were doing a very direct link with perhaps Westminster, or maybe reflecting on areas of our past that people may associate certainly with the Troubles and times of violence, it may not necessarily be respected fully by nationalist politicians. I would have to say my experience has been that the constituents are extremely influential on how councillors take decisions. I think one of and it's probably the same for other colleagues, but one of the experiences post-COVID that we have had is that everything is streamed live. So pre-COVID, you just had to think about the people in the room who had the papers. Post-COVID, you're wondering about the social media audience who are maybe not in sight of all of the information, but are messaging councillors to say, why not ask, why not do? And there's a little bit of that going on as well. And I think that's nearly more overt than the party politics. I would say, for just generally in the party politics, as you'd expect, the parties themselves are efficient. They plan well, they prepare well, and they certainly work with their colleagues across councils and at a national level also.
Allison, I know you were going to give some thought to a couple of examples of decisions perhaps where the process had gone well and perhaps not so well. What did you come up with there?
Yes, a couple. So so Enniskillen is one of our towns within the Fermanagh and Omagh district, and it's quite unique in that it's Ireland's only island town. And one of the things that we did for both it and Omagh was around place shaping plans, and a priority that was identified by the residents, by young people in particular, was having a designated marking point. So really entrance signage as you came into the main settlements. There would have been fairly basic road signs previously. So we did a very extensive community engagement process. We had business, schools, everyone involved in both of the towns, very consultative. We brought everything through the council, all of the details. We secured external funding, and the particular material of choice was a Cortex steel, now, which is very popular actually in signs here, but it takes a weathered effect. So that's all part of the if you like, the attractiveness. We duly got unanimous approval. Well, no, sorry, that's not quite right. There was one councillor who lost his seat actually in the May elections, expressed some concerns about it. Everyone else was fully supportive. The signs were up and running. And about 6 months post-installation, someone on social media tweeted, "Since when does the council put up signs that are rusty?" Which now no one remembers any of the reports, the discussion, the debate. And it's certainly a lot of food for thought. And then the other example, and sorry, what I would say is in a very serious way, it has had a very significant impact on staff who've been involved in that, because the vitriol that's actually been poured out in social media has been extraordinary. And I'm not saying that's ever acceptable, but certainly when everything has been reported, agreed, and through the media, and everyone has had a sort of collective amnesia about it. But the second element has been, for the last 12 months, it's probably fair to say across local government within the UK, but particularly in Northern Ireland, we have had probably the most unsettled period of industrial relations that we've had in 50 years. But that has meant our pay and normal terms and conditions are generally agreed at a national level, which would be UK-wide. But for the first time last year, our trade unions took local disputes against each of the 11 councils, and they essentially played each council off against each other to be able to get the best settlement for their members. That had a very significant financial impact on us. It meant we had to really find £2.5 million of in-year savings, which in a council our size, our budget's about 40 million a year, is huge. We had to take a number of very unpopular decisions about only prioritising core and essential services, and the council requested that we reduce our discretionary provision. One of the reductions was the cancellation of a fireworks display at Halloween, 31st of October, both in Enniskillen and Omagh. And we are still talking about the decision that, again, in some cases, even though everything was very clearly mapped, promoted, some members would have the view that it was not articulated clearly enough that that's what we meant, even though on a slide we showed we will remove this function and we will save the money associated with it. So I think the learning from that is, no matter how clearly you think you're explaining something, and again, if there is a populist backlash against a decision, I think it's very, very hard for elected members to move away from that and to side with their administrative role and responsibilities.
So it sounds like you've got the decision-making part down, Pat. It's the after the decision is made piece that perhaps could form another panel discussion at some point, Allison. I might let you have a breath there. Thank you for that. We'll come back to you, but I do notice we've got Monica back. Can you hear me, Monica?
I can. That has never happened to me, so I'm terribly sorry.
First time for everything. So let's pick it up. You were talking about the importance of values in that whole process, and I wanted to ask you as a follow-up question: how do you make sure everyone is signing on to those values when you get down to making the decisions that you want to base them on?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, what I was sort of starting to say, which sort of leads into that, was that, you know, what I often say to councillors is, you know, there's a number of things you need to think about when you make decisions. Obviously, what it is you're elected to do, the consultation that you have with your community once you've been elected, you know, when you ask the community what it is that they want. But also you have an obligation to, you know, you're also governing for those that cannot speak, those that, you know, cannot make representation, and those that have not been born yet, and now nature. So, you know, these are things that you have, and of course your decisions have to be lawful. So these are all of the things that you need to think about. And coming to your question about values, I think the other thing that is really, really important, we put a lot of effort into the city of Sydney, is the evidence base. So that we do spend a lot of time and a lot of effort on ensuring that we have excellent evidence coming from sort of the data that we collect, so that that is all available to the community, so that holds us all accountable. Because if you can see the evidence and then you make a decision that is contrary to that evidence, then you have to really have to explain what you're doing. So I think that's what I mean. So if I say, you know, the community value the sunlight, and then we have planning controls that ensure that the sunlight is protected, and then the community can see if we breach that, because suddenly a building goes up and it overshadows a park. So we've not been consistent with what it is that the community want or the things that they value. So it's, you know, it is it's in what we deliver also that we hold ourselves accountable.
Monica, you missed it because you dropped out, but Allison was talking about having her 40 elected members. How many have you got in the City of Sydney?
Only 10.
Right. That includes the Lord Mayor?
10 with the Lord Mayor, that's
10
right.
plus,
So
yes.
10 altogether.
So a question I wouldn't mind asking all the panelists at some point tonight is there's ongoing debate about respect in council decision making, and that's really at the heart of this topic this evening. In your experience, is it possible to have rigorous and robust debate that is still respectful, or are we losing the ability to maintain that?
Well, I have to say that, I think the council at the City of Sydney does have very respectful debate. And the other night, I actually spent a few hours with one of our advisory committees that the councillors that are members didn't participate. It was a very, very difficult couple of hours on a very difficult and sensitive matter in the community with a very sensitive community. And I was so impressed with the respectfulness of the debate and the respectfulness that people, the way that people conducted themselves. Chris, I think, we absolutely cannot accept conduct that is anything but respectful. And, it was really incumbent on all of us to say that that is not okay. I think it's often I see councillors come into council and I know that they've been watching, Parliament, or they've been, and they've seen really, really disrespectful behaviour, and they start out with some of that. And, and we really do really sort of try to take them aside and just say, look, this is just not how we do things around here. It really has to be called out. It cannot continue. Our children are seeing this and think that that's the way you conduct yourself. No.
So that calling out of that behaviour, have you got any advice for people on how you go about that? What's worked for you over all of that time?
Well, I think the most important thing that all of us can do, those of us that are not in the elected representatives when we're in those situations, is to ensure that we conduct ourselves really, really well. So, it's, the most, the advice, the best thing you can do when you're facing a bully is not respond, So when people behave badly, you cannot buy into it. And, it's really important, it's something we talk about all the time with the staff, you really need to conduct yourselves really, really well. And if you're facing conduct that is not appropriate and respectful, then, calmly deal with it or walk away. I will say just one thing on this, though. I think that the world is there's just so much more of this sort of bad behaviour in the community. And Allison, I did come in to hear you speak a little bit about the impact of social media on everything that we all do. I often say to our staff, is that I often feel like the community often treat the council and the staff like adolescents treat their parents. They're entitled, they're abusive, they're demanding, they're all of those sorts of things, right? And I put it down to the fact that there's a kind of really high, it's for us in the City of Sydney, I say it's the nexus between entitlement and anxiety. So you've got this huge sense of entitlement, but it comes from a kind of growing anxiety about the future, about, what's going on in the world, what's going on around them. And it is expressed as, I'm frightened, right? And if only you could fix that, my life would be better. If only you could do that for me, everything would be okay, right? And I say, I say the stuff, the community treat us like that because they know that we will never turn our backs on them, right? Because they can carry on like that. And occasionally we say, look, you're just not allowed in the library for a little while because that's just not okay. But you know what? That's only for a little while because your participation in what happens in the community is really, really important, and we'd like you to come back, right? So, so we're having to talk to our staff a lot about that. And I just think it's a very complicated time. And so we're seeing that behaviour everywhere. And there's got to be some people and some organisations that see themselves as a bit of an antidote to that by the way that we conduct ourselves.
Monica, it occurs to me, and there's already a question in the Q&A about how you get that agreement on what the community values, and what you've just been describing. It occurs to me that surely that's a hindrance in truly understanding what the community collectively values. Do you find that it's harder to get a read?
Oh, I think the tricky thing is getting all of that input and synthesizing it down to values and then feeding that back, because that's the constant conversation, right? It's a constant conversation going, okay, you've said these 10 things, but I've synthesized them to be that you value jobs in the community, right? And then, so whenever we do something, I mean, that the most common phrase at the City of Sydney is, you told us this, and this is why we are now doing this. Do you remember how you told us that was important? Well, this is what we're doing to try to address that thing that you think is important, that you told us was important, right? Or you told us this, but someone else told us something else, and those two things are both pretty valid, and we've got to find a pathway between those two things.
All right, we might just pause there, Monica. Thank you. Please stay with us, because we will come back to you, and we'd love to get some cross discussion between our panelists, because I suspect there's a few things people would like to dig into. I want to bring in, just to remind people to use the Q&A function, please, to place your questions there that we'll come to in a little while. I want to bring in Noelene Duff now, who, again, no stranger to our panels, and lovely to have you with us tonight, Noelene. Noelene's the Chair Administrator at the City of Casey, which has been at the heart of the Operation Sandon report, which we've spent a lot of time talking about, and I dare say there'll be a bit about this in tonight's presentation. Prior to being at the City of Casey, Noelene was the CEO at Whitehorse Council for 19 years. She was awarded a Public Service Medal in the 2020 Australia Day Honours, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Hi, Noelene.
Good evening, Chris.
Nice to see you. So in light of what we've heard already, and we're trying to make this discussion about how do you make good decisions, it tends to stray off a bit into values and councillor conduct. And I wonder what your thought is about the link between councillor conduct and making good decisions.
Look, I think it's everything, really. I think that as councillors, and I'm on that side of the fence in the role that I have as administrator in having the duties and obligations of the mayor and council. I think that the issue of behaviour is one that's highly underestimated. So it penetrates in the way, and Monica's spoken about this, Allison as well, the perception of the community in terms of the importance of the role of the council diminishes the respectful view that the community can have of the council and therefore its decision making. So it is really critical. And unfortunately, I think the record in Victoria is not a good one. When you look at the data, there have been 11 monitors since 2017. There have been 4 commissions of inquiry. There have been 4 councils sacked in Victoria. And there's been a lot of really excellent work done in consultation with the sector around what has contributed to those issues and how we can do better. One of the really good pieces of work was the Local Government Culture Project, which was concluded at the end of 2021. It's got it really just explains the issues really, really clearly and nominates, the lack of leadership skills, the lack of support provided to councillors, including training and development, and also the deficits in terms of early intervention when problems arise. They're really the 3 key things. So the challenges are there. A lot of the solutions have been documented. We've got a principles-based act in Victoria that is going to develop into some changes in the future, probably in the short-term future, as a result in particular of Operation Sandon, but also the broader experience. So we'll have more prescription, which is unfortunate, but I think that's where we're heading.
So for those who aren't aware, Operation Sandon looked into matters that occurred at the City of Casey, matters that led to that council being dismissed and Noelene and her team of administrators being appointed. Do you think that the outcome of Operation Sandon, and we note a lot of recommendations that the government's yet to respond to, is going to help or hinder the process of making good and proper decisions?
Well, hopefully it will help. Hopefully it's the extreme example of, corrupt and poor behaviour. The documentation in Operation Sandon is not just about corrupt behaviour. It's about the ingredients really that enabled that behaviour to grow and perpetuate at Casey. So again, already covered so eloquently by Monica, calling out the bad behaviour. And it'll be interested to hear Steve's comments on this. That's easily said, but difficult to deliver, because there's a whole lot of consequences when you speak out. And people need the opportunity to have exposure to conflict resolution training skills and all kinds of things. We demand and ask a great deal of councillors in the role that they take on. And I think it's fair to say most councillors really don't appreciate the dimension of that until they're in the thick of it. And so I do hope that Sandon will generate some very positive discussion about how we can prevent this kind of situation emerging again. There are always going to be, and I reference Operation Sandon in saying this, people that behave badly to the extreme end. And Sandon documents some very serious allegations in that regard. But I think the majority of councillors go into the role with the very best of intentions for their community, and some of them strike some of this conflict that is just extraordinary to them. And, yes, it is very, very challenging.
Noelene, what was the approach you took at the City of Casey, given that it took so long for Operation Sandon to come to its conclusion? You might have had an idea of what was going to come out the end of it, but you wouldn't have really known. What did you do at Casey in the interim to try and shore up those processes that you knew were going to be called into question?
Well, at the time that I was appointed, the public hearings for Operation Sandon were live. So the council was sacked. It's very interesting walking into an organisation that probably really wasn't aware of some of the elements of behaviour that are documented in the allegations in Sandon. So there was quite a bit of baggage as to what was the agenda that I brought. And the agenda that I brought, and that subsequently the two panel members that are part of the administration panel at Casey, being myself, Miguel Belmar and Cameron Boardman, we really set about a very high level and then lower level audit of all of the processes and systems, etc., and worked with the cooperation of Casey staff, our Chief Executive Officer, the executive team and governance team, and other staff very cooperatively. And I do note that there were no allegations that have arisen in Operation Sandon about staff. But we really wanted to draw on the best practice that was available across the sector. And it is endless, the amount of good practice across the sector that's well documented. Some of it's come out of things like the Geelong Commission of Inquiry, but certainly the work that IBAC have done in terms of prevention, the work that organisations like the VLGA have done through training and development, the MAV, LG Pro, the Culture Project. There's so much material that you don't have to look very far. So we can draw on that. We aim to really try to develop the best practice governance framework. We documented that. We were transparent about that with the community, documented the actions that we were taking, and we continued to report on that and continue to do that ongoing, as well as obviously to the Minister through our quarterly community report.
Yeah. I want to get to our last speaker in just a moment. Perhaps one last question for the moment for you, Noelene. I know you've got a view on governance rules, and every council sets its own governance rules. There are obviously commonalities across that, but you've got a view there should be more consistency with the way governance rules are applied?
I do, and I think that that's evidenced in part by some of the issues that we've been experiencing in Victoria with attendees at our council meetings recently, and some of the disruptive attendance that has occurred. I think members of our community should be able to come to Casey or Mornington Peninsula Shire and experience the same fundamental processes. That council chamber should be the key decision-making forum for the council. There are many, many other points of consultation, entry, access to information by community, electronically, directly, face-to-face, etc. That council chamber, in my view, should be the decision-making forum, and there should be consistency across the sector as to how that forum is utilised by all councils in Victoria. And similarly, the code of conduct. I think that there should be consistency. To be fair to councillors entering a system around internal resolution processes, etc., I believe there should be consistency there as well.
Some themes that we might come back to if we have time. Thank you, Noelene. We'll come back to you, but right now I want to bring in our final speaker for the evening, Steve Holland, the Mayor of Mornington Peninsula Shire. Councillor Holland, welcome to you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great to have you with us. You were elected to the council in 2020, a lifelong Mornington Peninsula resident and a self-employed web developer running a small business from home there in Mount Eliza, but you've previously worked with the police and the Victorian Bar in various media roles. So a rather unique set of experiences to bring to being the mayor of a growing shire. Can you tell us a bit about your approach to being the mayor, leading a group of councillors and having to make what you hope would be the right decisions?
Well, I've had quite a unique experience in the sense that upon first being elected, a large number of the councillors, and there's 11 where I am, were brand new to local government, myself included, although I had previous political experience new to local government. And then subsequently, we lost a number of colleagues too, which has meant the typical stages of forming, storming, norming, and then hopefully performing have been disrupted multiple times, with new colleagues having to be inducted into the councillor group. And so that's a very difficult thing because those initial stages of a new council are quite critical. We often, and I think this is unique to Victoria in the sense that we got the new Local Government Act. And I think just the timing was unfortunate in the sense that a lot of inductions were compliance-based, black and white. This is the new act. This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't do. And that's the way it's going to be. But that sort of black and white compliance approach doesn't necessarily develop good relationships amongst the councillor group, doesn't allow them to get to know each other, get to know how each other works, how they think, what their values are as individuals, and perhaps the group dynamics not set in train in a number of councils across Victoria in the way they possibly should have been. And I think the pandemic contributed to that as well, because I know in the case of Mornington Peninsula Shire, we didn't have in-person meetings. In fact, we didn't step foot into the council chamber until about a year, possibly almost a year and a half after we were elected, because of the pandemic and the restrictions there, which makes it incredibly difficult to get to know each other. And it's a very different environment online as opposed to in person as well. So it's been a very steep learning curve, as has already been touched on. And I think that's part of the difficulty with every 4 years getting a new councillor group, that steep learning curve, and councillors getting to understand their own role as well as getting to know each other.
Steve, what do you think that first part of the term had in terms of an impact on the decisions you were making as a group of councillors as you look back?
Well, I mean, I've been quite fortunate to have good colleagues. The one thing I would say is that what we know is that, and I see this with other councils throughout Victoria and elsewhere in Australia or even internationally, when the conduct is poor, when behaviour is poor, then you're putting good decision making on the line, because there's all of these distractions. And it's not just distractions. It's really a reversion to kind of primitive decision making when there's poor behaviour. What I mean by that is you can get groupthink. People revert to party politics, which is not so much an issue in my council, but I know it's an issue elsewhere. Closed-mindedness, appeals to populism, trying to whip up community sentiment one way or the other. In fact, Allison touched on an issue before, these days with live streaming of council meetings, and I had the unique experience of texting a community member in the middle of a council meeting who is a long-time stalwart of watching and attending council meetings, who was shocked that they were getting a response from their local councillor in the middle of a council meeting. And that's, I think, a new dynamic that people are getting used to. And I think that change is going to be constant. But when there's poor conduct, it's a distraction and you get poor decisions, and good governance falls by the wayside when you've got bad behaviour happening.
So as a mayor, and perhaps not even just for mayors, what sort of resources are available to you, have you found, or are there resources available to help you navigate those conduct-related issues that might be creeping into the decision-making process?
Well, it can be a pretty lonely place, I have to say, and there's a lot of similarities. I think I'm self-employed and a small business owner. It can be very lonely for self-employed people, and I think it could be very lonely sometimes for councillors. We rely heavily on our colleagues and the people that are around us. And I think that's where organisations like MAV and the VLGA can provide an excellent network for councillors that might find themselves a bit trapped with no friends amongst their colleagues, or a support network locally. I think those networks are really important, and the training is really important. The key thing with the training, I think, is often it's very compliance-based, as I said. And when it's compliance-based, and we know this is the case, I think the historian Niall Ferguson said something along the lines of, these days, with more and more rules being passed about how to do things or what to do or what not to do, people stop asking the question, is what I'm doing right or is what I'm doing wrong? And they start asking a very different question, which is what I'm doing compliant? And as we all probably know, you can be compliant and still behave quite poorly. And that doesn't mean you're doing the right thing. And so I think that's what I've noticed is most interesting, is that kind of shift away from developing good relationships amongst the councillor group and developing a good value set, good principles, a good moral compass, and more towards the compliance base of thinking and training. And that I see as a bit of a problem going forward, as particularly in Victoria, as the state government gets more and more stringent and more prescriptive with the way councillors are supposed to act and behave, and the way local government as a sector is supposed to act and what they're supposed to do.
Do you think the role of mayor has become even more critical in enabling that harmonious decision-making environment, or is there an unfair burden falling on the mayor, given that, in Victoria, most mayors are only in for 12 months at a time?
Yeah, that's right. I think, the honest response I've got is it's 50-50, because if we look at from a compliance perspective, black and white in the Local Government Act, the role of the mayor is to ensure that councillors are, abiding by the code of conduct, for example. It's black and white in the Act. Mayors obviously have a role at chairing meetings, and, the council chamber is that public decision-making forum where the decisions are made. And if that behaviour is not appropriate in the chamber, then again, there's distractions and you're not getting through the agenda, and meetings are running into the dead of night, and therefore not the best decision-making environment. So the role is really important. The question I've got, and it's more a question of state government in Victoria, is, what powers are you giving the mayor to be able to ensure that they can do that? And that's where it's getting more and more difficult, I think. And I think there's a very heavy reliance in Victoria under the new Act at the moment on the inspectorate. And that means things get escalated very quickly out of the hands of the mayor, and suddenly you've got an arbiter or a monitor in place, and that's a massive escalation to something that could maybe be dealt with, internally via mediation.
A few threads we could pick up there. One thing you said reminded me, Steve. I just recently watched a council that I won't name, and the meeting had gone well past midnight, and they were dealing with a pretty complex sort of issue at that time of night. Is it fair to expect councillors to make good decisions at the end of a 4-hour meeting that's going into the early hours?
Is it fair? I'm not sure it's fair, but bad luck, you've got to make a good decision regardless of the hour. I know that getting a call at 5 a.m. in the morning for breakfast radio, you've still got to make a good decision then too. Look, I think to Noelene's point about more consistency around the governance rules, I think would help there. And obviously, these days, that's not what we'd expect in a workplace. And yet that's our expectation on elected representatives. And I think that's the unfair element. Because the community expects their elected representatives to be performing at their best all the time. And we can talk, that's probably a subject for a whole nother forum about the community's expectations. But because of that expectation, I think the sector has to have consistent rules around that so that the best decision-making environment can be delivered for councillors to operate exceptionally.
Thank you, Steve. I think it's been really important to get the mayor and councillor perspective on this discussion this evening. And I know you've got another event coming up, so if you have to log off, we won't think poorly of you. But I think we've got you for a little while yet. We're going to go to Q&A, and I encourage people to pop their questions in the Q&A box now, if you've thought of one and haven't written it down yet, because it's time to move to this phase of our session. And Catherine Arndt is going to come in and manage the Q&A. Catherine?
Thank you, Chris. And well, what a fantastic discussion so far. It has struck me, though, as we've been talking tonight or today or this morning, wherever we are, that we could easily have another panel discussion about democracy in the digital age. Recently, I spoke on a panel in regard to this, and the opportunities, the risks and limitations of digitisation are very real. And we've heard, I think, from all of our panellists on that very issue today. Social media, the rapid spread of information and often misinformation, and the inequitable access to digital technology and also digital literacy in the community all do impact the way we undertake democracy today. But enough from me. I will go to the questions that are in the chat. Monica, there's one here for you, and I think you have touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but you may wish to go into more detail. How do you handle councillors behaving badly?
Maybe I've been a bit lucky because I have worked for councils where some councillors have behaved very, very badly. And so it's not so much that I guess I don't often have to deal with the councillor and their bad behaviour, but look, I've had plenty of conversations where I've had to meet with a councillor and say, look, that way of speaking to staff is inappropriate. You'd have to apologise to that person. Under our code of conduct, there's a number of steps along the way to reconcile issues, to resolve issues before you get to the full code of conduct complaint process. And I think I've only ever had in the entire time that I've been at the council ever had a code of conduct complaint go to the nth, go to the full investigation. And that was really only because it was a complaint that was completely taken out of my hands because of the nature of the complaint. Every other complaint we have managed to manage by sitting down and talking it through and appealing and putting forward what an appropriate course of action should be. So I think that's it. But I think I just want to just answer this question slightly differently, to talk about all the things you can do to mitigate so you don't get there. And Noelene talked about this a lot. It's about the way that you manage the council, the way, So one of the things that we do at the City of Sydney is I absolutely very, very, very rarely put up anything to council that is anything that isn't something that I only put up things that only the council can make decisions on. Everything that goes up is only at the council table because it requires a decision of council. Everything else is done outside of that. It doesn't mean it's not done by the councillors, because it's not all, it might be delegated to me, but there are many, many issues which we need to deal with every single day, but we don't take them into the council chamber, right? So we spent hours and hours on briefings. We spent hours and hours on community workshops. So we tease it all out way before we get to the council chamber. So much has been said. The value of that is everybody's had the chance to hear everything. Everybody's had the chance to talk. That's all occurred before we get there. The other thing is that, of course, that gives me enormous insight into where the council is and where the community is, so that the final report, when it does require a council decision, is, hopefully addresses those things. And very, very rarely do I not put up a report. And it happened the other day where we were consulting on something where I really thought we were okay. And I really thought we were going to get a decision, and that we had the community on side and the council on side. But we had a range of we had a briefing with the council, well, 3 discussions. And then I went back to the key community group, and then I had to say, I can't put this up because we're not there yet. So I'm going to keep working on this because we're just not there yet. And there's no point having a 5-hour debate about it because we're just not there yet. We have to get there, So I think what I'm saying is all of those other things mitigate against. And I think, I don't know, Noelene, in New South Wales, we do have a consistent code of conduct, code of meeting practice. You can alter it slightly. I mean, we don't have meetings till midnight because the code tells you when the meeting finishes, and that's it. And the Lord Mayor finishes the meeting. So, those things help a lot.
Thank you, Monica, for those insights. I'll go to Councillor Holland, who is happy to take the question from Councillor Claridge that is in the Q&A, and it is also related to this similar topic. So over to you, Councillor Holland.
Thanks, Catherine. I think it's a great question. And this is one of the things, relating to governance rules, because different councils will have different rules about how, say, a point of order is handled. And something that I've tried to do in my capacity as mayor, and I think it's important for all mayors to do it, is to provide a lot of clarity around some of the clauses in your governance rules that are open to interpretation. So how does the mayor of the day interpret a comment or a point of order when somebody's called about being offended? So a councillor calls a point of order and says that they're offended. The first thing to do with a point of order that is incumbent on the mayor is to, if the debate clock's going, you stop the clock and everybody's silent. And so you've got to make sure that you take all of the emotion out of the room, all of the heat, straight away. And if somebody tries to interject and tries to, you shut it down. There's got to be silence so that the mayor can provide a response to the point of order and say, I accept the point of order, or I don't accept the point of order, and here's the reason why. And councillor, could you please do X, Y, Z, or X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and then return to the meeting. It's about taking as much emotion out of it as possible and being really clear and defined about, okay, councillors, if somebody calls a point of order because they're offended, this is how I define offence. And this, I'll try to be consistent as much as possible throughout my term as mayor, as chairing the meetings, about what I'm actually going to define as offensive or not offensive. And I think it's really important for mayors, and that is the role of the mayor, to provide as much clarification on that as possible and to take the emotion out of the room as quickly as possible, because sometimes it can get very heated and instantly, councillors will want to have a back and forth. No, you've got to make use of the governance rules, the points of order, and that is a really ordered approach to that. You hear both sides and there's no shouting, no talking over each other, and then you move on to debate. And then the other thing I'd say is, once a decision is made, whether it's on a point of order or a vote takes place, it's about agreeing to disagree. And this is sometimes has to be a learned skill for some elected politicians. And that's not just unique to local government, but some training about agreeing to disagree and learning how to pick yourself up, dust yourself off and move on if you've lost a vote, is really critical, and it's an important skill to learn for elected representatives.
I think it'd be interesting to get a different jurisdiction's perspective on this. So I might go to Allison. How do you handle things in your council group when they are going off the rail there?
I think it's important probably to say that the vast majority of councillors are respectful and want to do the best, both for themselves, their parties and their constituents. Probably in our last mandate, which ran from 2019 to May of this year, we had an extremely, I think, difficult time politically as well as for officers, and very disruptive behaviours. And that in one case, and just going back to Steve's immediate comments there, really the mayors, the chairs of the meetings were put under huge pressure. And even though there were clear rulings, clear decisions, disruption continued, and we had on numerous occasions to exclude members from meetings just to allow business to happen. And I think in some instances, we probably did have evidence of tactics to delay decision making. So it was aversion, disruption being used to just delay things. In terms of the practicalities, I mean, similar to what others have said, in the first instance, we would seek to deal with the matter informally, because sometimes things are said that may not be deliberately intentional, to cause offence, to certainly, if the member is from a political party, to advise their group leader, have a quiet word. And generally that has the desired effect, though sometimes it doesn't. The other slightly, and I'm not sure if this is the same situation as in your own jurisdiction, the code of conduct for elected members in Northern Ireland is not governed by the councils. So we can actually not investigate any complaint into an elected member. It's taken out of our hands by the Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman. And what has been increasingly the case over the last number of years are members of the public are lodging multiple complaints about councillors. It may be perceptions about behaviour, what they have said, their views on matters, nothing directly related to behaviours. And then maybe just the final thing about dealing with the behaviours more generally. Local government was reformed in Northern Ireland in 2015, so we went from 26 councils down to 11. And pre-2015, committees would have been what maybe many administrators would remember. They were largely private discussions, and they allowed an opportunity for members to engage fully on an issue. The minutes of those meetings were then considered at the council meeting. Post 2015, all of our meetings, committees, subcommittees and council, are all fully open. There are very, very few exceptions when you can go into committee or stop broadcasting. And while I think that has been positive in some aspects for openness and transparency, I actually think it has removed the opportunities for councillors to have maybe honest discussions with each other without the glare of the public and the media. So I think in an attempt to get things more open, it has actually polarised debate in a slightly different way.
Thank you, Allison, for those perspectives. I was very interested in Councillor Holland's views about the compliance versus the what is right reflections. And we have seen within the Victorian jurisdiction some decisions recently, some councillor conduct panel decisions where I guess that compliance, and that's the way they have to be reviewed, because they must look at the regulations or the legislation that sits behind the frameworks that we use here, where what most of us would consider was not actually the right way of behaving, or most of us would consider to be offensive, was actually deemed to be, under the sort of the law, as simply robust political debate. And that, of course, has implications for the way in which, I guess, potentially councillors can then continue to behave in those ways, which, as Councillor Holland suggested, might not actually be the right ways of behaving, but could potentially be seen to be compliant. So actually in Victoria, the Local Government Inspectorate is about to launch a review of the Councillor Conduct Framework. And it would be actually very interesting to have a future discussion around what some of the other jurisdictions have in their Councillor Conduct Framework, but we'll leave that for another day. Now, we have some more questions in the chat. There is one actually from the VLGA president who I was neglecting not mentioning earlier. Councillor Denise Massoud is in the room, and she says community may be surveyed or engaged to respond in regards to a topic. However, some councillors will argue the statistical relevance is not significant. How can we get deeper engagement within a community to support statistical relevance and encourage more harmonious decision making?
Any panelists feel like they'd like to tackle that one? I did see you nodding, Steve. Yes, go.
I could give a very short answer. What we do on the Mornington Peninsula Shire, we have a standing citizens panel, which is a bit like a jury. So there is each year, we've the third year in a row now, and 3 different cohorts each time, are randomly selected. So we send around 10,000 letters out to households across the peninsula. And there's an external provider called the Sortition Foundation that selects a cross-section of the community of around 50 panelists. They are a cross-section of the community in terms of age, gender, employment status, whether they're renters or ratepayers, homeowners, and their ability to get a perfect cross-section based on the data that they select is really impressive. And we, as a council group, come together and decide which are the big issues that we want to send to the panel to get their advice and feedback on. It's been an incredibly useful tool. And not only that, but I say this as an elected representative, it effectively creates a panel of 50 community members who go back into the community and sing the praises of local government and all of the challenges that we've got, because the issues that we're giving to this panel are not easy issues, quite deliberately. They are the tough issues that we ourselves are thinking about. And so we can talk about statistical representation and, as the lights go off on me here, energy efficient, which can talk about, when we put something on our website for feedback and only get 100 responses with a population of 170,000, not great. Or we can think of more creative ways to do what I guess you'd call deliberative democracy. So that's just one, I guess, example and answer to that.
If I could just say, look, I think councils have got to be very, very clear about the methodology they're using, and very, so we will use, we will commission surveys which are statistically sound, right? So I say to council, this is a statistically sound survey. This is a adequate sample size with all the proper representation. So this is you can rely on that being a statistically sound finding. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it. It doesn't have to do that, but you can rely on that being a statistically sound finding. Then we do community engagement, and every report that we put to council has a very comprehensive community engagement report attached to it, with the graphs and the this and the that, right? The comments and all of that sort of stuff. Now, we don't pretend that's statistically sound because that is voluntary. So what we say, this is what people who were interested in saying something said. Now, sometimes it's really clear. Everybody said we like the idea. The other day we looked at one where there was not a single thing that we were recommending in a suite of a kind of, this is a traffic plan, not a single recommendation where there was a majority on anything. And so we just went, we have to go back to the community because there's just there's nothing here we can confidently say to council, if you do this, the vast majority of people will be happy with this. I mean, that's against, of course, what's right to do and what's possible to do, right? And then there's the sort of the citizens' juries that Councillor Holland has spoken about, and we use citizens' juries all of the time. But again, they are to do a deep dive into things. When we do citizens' juries, I mean, the juries are engaged for, when we did the citizens' jury for the refresh of our corporate plan, our strategic plan was, I think, over 6 weekends. So it was like 12 days that people had to commit to, where they had to commit to listening to experts on the topics. It was not about opinion, it was about evidence. These are the experts, and based on that information and that opportunity, then they gave us their preferred the preferred things that they wanted us to do. Now, again, all that is intended to do is to give elected representatives a deeper insight into the thinking of the community, right? And more confidence that if they go down a particular path, a community is more likely to accept that decision because it is within the realms of the imagination and the expectation of the community. So I think you have to be very clear about the method that you use and very honest about this is statistically sound. This is a voluntary survey. It's an indication, but it's not statistically sound.
Thanks, Monica. I think Noelene might like to add something to that. And I'm just going to say to Catherine, I think we need to start thinking about wrapping up because we're going to lose Steve and it's almost time. Noelene?
I agree with what's been said, but then there's also the dimension of thought leadership on critical issues. If we were only going to survey the community and get the outcomes and direction from them in terms of what is palatable or what's on a scale of palatable from a community perspective, we wouldn't need elected representatives to debate issues and add the broader intelligence and thought leadership that can be brought to those debates. So it needs to be a blend of both evidence-based, I agree with that, but then there's also some higher order issues that council do need to determine on and need to bring some different perspectives to. And I think that is the gift of democracy that these debates and processes at the local level can actually bring.
Catherine, there's one question there, if I may just sort of jump in, that I think we might be able to touch on briefly. And Allison sort of talked a bit about this. Councillor Jackson at Hume is asking about the role of the mayor in the context of dealing with a complaint about councillor conduct and perhaps being reluctant to do so because it means they might lose the support of their colleagues for another mayoral term. That's that political consideration. Allison talked about it not being dealt with in the council at all. I wonder whether any of the other panelists might have a view on that.
That's the bravery of leadership. At the end of the day, you put your hand up for the mayoral role, then that is the big packaged gift with the big bow that you get. You get the good and the bad. You get the good behaviour and the great debate, and you get the difficult personalities and the lack of harmony, back to the topic. So I think, if you don't feel that you're a person that has those skills, then don't put your hand up to be mayor.
Thanks, Noelene. Nice and succinct. Steve, anything to add to that as a mayor?
No, I agree. But look, there's enormous pressure there. And I think, directly to the councillor's question, I think this is something that will come out in the review, I hope, because there is a problem there that is identified especially when staff are the target of poor behaviour. And often colleagues are not witness to that either. And if you are a local government sector employee, do you want to be known as the person who's made a complaint about an elected councillor? I can imagine the enormous stress that would come with actually formalising a complaint like that. And that would be extremely unfair because what we're trying to develop is professional workplaces. So there is a larger issue here as well that I'm hoping it forms part of the state government's conduct review.
Okay, I'll just check whether Allison or Monica have anything to add. Don't feel like you need to. No, terrific. We might draw a line there. Catherine, some final thoughts from you?
Thank you, Chris, for that, and thank you to our panellists. I think it's fair to say that local governments have been dealing with serious incidents in recent years, ranging from abuse and sustained campaigns of harassment and threats of violence. But this is about more than that, the discussion. This is about challenging that attitude that it is somehow okay to insult and berate people who are trying their best to provide communities with important and often essential services. I'd also like to make the comment, and Councillor Holland touched on this, that council officers, and we haven't really spoken a lot about them today, are non-political and are there to do, I guess, very specific and often difficult jobs. And from a community perspective, if someone's dissatisfied with a service, councils need to have processes in place that enable people to report it, but not actually target members of staff. And we've seen certainly some of that recently in Victoria. So in Australia, in particular, the sector's calling on the state government to recognise the scale of workplace abuse of staff and also elected representatives, and provide greater support to the sector through campaigns to educate the community about the important role and responsibilities of elected representatives and the work of councils, and also undertake some policy reforms. So in particular, the VLGA wants to see some investment in training and professional development and support services for councillors, and somehow a fundamental shift in the community attitude through an awareness campaign on violence and aggression. And also, as I said, understanding more importantly, the important and critical role that our elected representatives have. I think the discussion that we've heard today has raised many issues, and we could talk, I think, have many more panels and deep dives into a number of the aspects. But I would like to thank, on behalf of the VLGA, our panellists and also our partner LGIU for once again bringing these discussions to you. And thank you, Chris, back to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I echo those thoughts. So Monica Barone, CEO of the City of Sydney, thank you. Noelene Dunn, Duff, the Chair Administrator at the City of Casey. Steve Holland, Mayor at Mornington Peninsula Shire, and Allison McCullough, the Chief Executive at Fermanagh and Omagh District Council. Thank you to you all for sharing your thoughts and insights with us this evening. It's been terrific to have you here. Thank you to all of our attendees. The session has been recorded. I do note a fair number of people registered and didn't join us tonight. It's because they'll be waiting for that link to come out to be able to watch it back on the VLGA Connect YouTube channel in the coming days. That just leaves me to thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again on a future Global Executive Panel. For now, good morning to the UK and good night to Australia.